So someone commented on one of my videos requesting if I could make a video on why on the Pratt & Whitney Neos we can sometimes view the engine oil quantity without having to ground power up the FADECs. So I thought that was a great observation and a great topic to discuss. And I also thought we could use this opportunity to discuss a little bit about the FADEC in general. So what is the FADEC? So the Full Authority Digital Engine Control. When we visualize or talk about the FADEC, we usually picture one computer, but the FADEC is actually a collective term for an entire ecosystem. So the FADEC consists of the EEC, the Electronic Engine Control or Electronic Engine Computer, as it's sometimes known as. It's also sometimes known as on some engine variants as the ECU, Engine Control Unit. So the FADEC comprises of the EEC and all the other peripheral components, the valves and the sensors and whatnot, are collectively known as the FADEC. So the FADEC is completely in charge of all engine control and monitoring and engine parameter display as well. And some of its functions are things like controlling the your fuel flow control and modulating the variable stator vanes and variable bleed valves, which is nothing but a bunch of vanes and valves which under certain engine conditions redirect air in such a way to ensure the airflow through the engine is smooth at all times to prevent potential engine stall. And the FADEC is also in charge of things like turbine clearance control, which again is nothing but air from a section of the engine, usually it's a stage of the HP compressor, which is redirected towards the turbine fan case. So it basically cools the turbine case, and in doing so reduces the clearance between the turbine case and the turbine blades, and in turn improving turbine efficiency, performance, and reducing EGT as well. And the FADEC is also in charge of your fuel oil heat exchangers, which cools IDG oil and engine oil, and in general is in charge of engine monitoring and also engine parameter display. But regarding engine parameter display, there is one caveat which we will discuss soon. Now let's talk about where the FADEC gets its power from. So the FADEC has its own power source. It has an alternator which is run by the engine's accessory gearbox. The same gearbox which the engine runs, it drives this gearbox, and the same gearbox that drives your fuel pumps, engine driven hydraulic pumps, IDG, and while the engine is getting started, the air driven starter motor and things like that. So it also runs this alternator which then powers the FADEC. But this of course kicks in once the engine is running. On most engine variants it's about 10 to 12% N2 is when the FADEC's alternator kicks in, and it gets its power from there. So until that point of time, the FADEC uses the aircraft's power. Okay, so now to the meat of the matter, and that is why on the Pratt & Whitney Neo aircraft we can sometimes view the engine oil quantity without having to ground power up the FADECs. So the reason for this is that remember how I mentioned that the FADEC has its own power source, its own alternator which is run by the engine and kicks in once the engine starts to get running at about 10 to 12% N2. And so when the engine is not running, as I also mentioned, the FADEC uses the aircraft's power to power itself. So some of the scenarios where this happens is one, when we turn the FADEC ground power push buttons on using the buttons on the top, push buttons on the top, we basically tell the FADEC to use the aircraft's power and power itself up, and that's how we view the engine parameters. Another way in which the FADEC uses the aircraft's power is after initial aircraft power up. So like the engineer is usually the first person to do that, right? Before the first flight of the day, he or she comes in and powers up the aircraft. So for a certain duration of time after this initial power up, the FADEC remains powered. And after engine shutdown, after each flight, Also, the FADEC continues to remain powered using the aircraft's power. This duration of time on most engine variants is 5 minutes, but on the Pratt & Whitney Neo aircraft, it's 30 minutes. So after engine shutdown, the FADECs continue to remain powered on the aircraft's power for 30 minutes. This is why, an aircraft comes, a PW aircraft comes and parks, and you as the next operating crew get into the aircraft, and it's been within 30 minutes that the previous pilots shut down the engines. So you just open up the engine SD page and you can see the engine parameters, including the oil quantity. Another way in which you can make the FADEC use the aircraft's power is when you turn the engine mode selector to crank or ignition start. But using this to check the oil quantity is of course a non-standard and honestly just a lazy way of doing it, because when you do put the mode selector to crank or ignition start, the aircraft thinks that you're going to crank or start the engine, so the packs actually go off and it's going to be an unnecessary off-on cycle of the packs. Anyway, so moving on. There's actually a plot twist, because you may have also noticed that on the older aircraft, so on the CEOs, the IAEs and the CFM56s, you can see the oil quantity without the FADEC powering up at all, even if it's been more than 30 minutes. So the FADECs aren't powered up, it's been like a couple of hours since the previous pilots shut down the engines, but you can still see the oil quantity. So this was the caveat I was talking about as well earlier on. So the reason for this is that the schematic in the FCOM is, and this one is shown for all MSNs, it's not misleading, but it's a bit oversimplified, and honestly there's no sugarcoating it, it's just misleading. So this shows all the engine sensors giving information to the FADEC and then it moving on to our displays. But what happens on the CFM56s and the IAs is that certain engine parameters come straight from the sensors, engine oil quantity being one of them. So they come straight from the engine oil quantity sensor, for example, straight to our displays, sort of bypassing the FADEC. And this is why on those aircraft, you can always see certain parameters before powering up the FADEC itself.